I study human dimensions of coastal management. So what I thought it might be fun to try to do is try to like, address this question, like why might one do this, and why is it interesting or relevant and or important. So my goal for this particular talk is to give you sufficient background on my work and interest to facilitate a conversation about research opportunities and challenges in coastal human dimensions research, current management relevance, and potential for focus study in and around Castle Channel. But so like really, I want to talk about sort of what I do, and I'm gonna describe what I do, but what I kind of hope that you take away from this is sort of why I do it and how I do it, even if I'm not like explicitly talking about it in those terms. So what we'll do just really quickly, I'll try to start with a high level sort of on kind of the theoretical framing for sort of my development as a person who thinks about these things and how that manifests in what I do. And I kind of overview some of recent and ongoing projects that I've been working on. And then to dive into three of them, three of which I haven't actually presented before. So they're because they're kind of new, hot off the press, or else in progress things. So if I totally like bungle my explanations of things, now you know. And then so hopefully there'll be time at the end to talk about how sort of some of these things that have happened already and are happening now can feed into more fun things to do here. So kind of the what next discussion. Okay, so I thought I should start just a little bit of like, human dimensions, but like these are like my human dimensions. So I started as a biologist, a marine biologist specifically, and trained in oceanography. So I very much started like thinking about the nature that I was in, just thinking about the nature itself. I did a lot of early work really thinking about ecosystem health indicator, like how do we know if an ecosystem is healthy, right? What does that even mean? I did some work with the California Rapid Assessment Monitoring Project. That was with John's old boss, Ambrose. I work for Reef Check International. They do sort of coral health ecosystem monitoring. My master's work focused on like what are those aspects of coral health and biology and ecology that could actually inform how we are making management decisions about coral. What I kind of was really focusing on is like what's happening in the ecosystem. And I had this epiphany, especially doing my master's work, that like, this is not the whole story. And this is like not totally redundant to what we just did, but you're probably going to figure out pretty quickly where I'm going with this. So I ended up leaving academia and I went to Washington, D.C. Because I was interested in if we can have an indicator of ecosystem health and inform a management change. Well, how do we manage? And so I actually went and worked on Capitol Hill and actually like tried to play my hand sort of on the governance side of things, like how do we actually govern ecosystems? And I realized that's not the whole story. And this is my question because we really don't govern ecosystems. We certainly can impact them, but when we talk about sort of how we govern the environment, environmental governance, we're dealing with people, and that was a big sort of moment, a big epiphany for me. I didn't have an interdisciplinary education initially, and so what I have done since is sort of devote myself to trying to think about this whole system, to try to think about, for example, what we define as the human dimensions, which you can think of as these arrows, right? So this is how we affect the coast, focus on the coast, and how the coast affects us. And so if those are those arrows, the shape and size and direction of those arrows is informed in large part by sort of the policies that we use to govern the environment, to govern the people that are interacting with it. So that's sort of how I got to defining myself the way I define myself. I've kind of gotten tired of saying, oh, I'm a human dimensions, and like, oh, what's that? And so I've been trying out this new phrase, which is coastography. But I made it up, and it hasn't really caught on yet. So if you want to tell your friends, I define coastography as the science of the coast and its associated social ecological system, including the land, ocean inhabitants, management institutions, and two, the study of coastal sustainability. So if we can get coastography to, if there's oceanography, there's sociology, why can't there be coastography? Anyway, I think of myself as a coastographer, and you're the first audience that I've actually divulged. It's a bit of a coming out as a coastographer. So I kind of unpacked the human dimension side, like what does that mean? I do the human dimensions of coastal resources. This is maybe not the answer now, but like when I say coastal resources, what do you think about? Like what pops into mind?
Fish.
Fish. Yeah, people always think about fish. What else?
Recreation.
Recreation. Thank you. Is it like a plant? Other coastal resources?
Coastal agriculture.
Coastal agriculture. Of course. Yeah. But quite often it's fish and fisheries. It's oil. It's these extractive sort of resources. They're like things that we are taking out of the coastal system. This is what Google Images thinks that coastal resources are, and I was actually quite pleased. If you search marine resources, it's a lot more sort of fish and oil that comes up in the image search. But this is, we see still a lot of fish and coral and fishing boats. We also see some coral reefs. But we see white sandy beaches. We see this looks like a water treatment facility, wetland, salt marsh, yeah. Still some fishing, some big houses. So I try to think about coastal resources a little more in a different way. There's plenty of people that study fish and plenty of people that study oil, but there aren't a lot of people that study other things like the beach itself, thinking about the beach as this really important resource and how we as a coastal state, as a series of coastal communities interact with the beach as a coastal resource. And I already mentioned that this is not an unimportant question. Beaches are incredibly important, both socially and economically in California in many places, and also ecologically. So human dimensions of coastal resource management. So we can unpack that statement. So as to how we affect coastal resources, how they affect us, and then sort of how we manage these effects. So what do those arrows actually look like? So I'll just go through a couple of projects that are in progress, focusing on this top part of the equation. How are the things that we are doing as societies, as coastal peoples, and how are they impacting coastal resources directly? And so this is work following up on some things I did in my dissertation, looking specifically at waves as resources, and then following up on that, a project in Costa Rica. Focused primarily on waves and trying to think about it in a larger way as a really important beaches and coastal tourism is a really important economic driver in Costa Rica. How will climate change at a high level affect these really important resources? On the other side of the equation, I'm really interested in how those resources are affecting us. There's a bias towards studying economic impacts, and it's important to know, how much a beach contributes to an economy, but people don't visit the beach because it's valuable economically. They visit the beach for other reasons, and I seek to understand those also. So two aspects of that I'm really interested in are local ecological knowledge. So that is sort of the kind of expert knowledge that you might acquire about a system as you invest increasing amounts of time and energy in it. This is something that has been studied largely in the fisheries context. How can we understand what's happening with the fisheries resource? Ask the fishermen. So I'm really interested in who are the people on the coast that we can go to and have that sort of same kind of conversation and find these repositories of data that are hitherto untapped. I'm also really interested in place attachment as a concept, which is the way that sort of we as sentient organisms interact with the world around us, and the way that we assign meaning and value to places in different ways. So your bedroom means something different than this classroom, than the Starbucks at the airport. And so I'm really interested in the way that people attach to coastal places. And it's actually a really interesting and important thing to understand, because it in many ways affects what those people then do there. Do they engage in stewardship? Do they engage in pro-environmental behaviors? Are they going to come to your beach cleanup? Are they going to contribute to an environmental cause? Are they going to care about this place? And the more attached to it they are, the more likely they are to do those kinds of things. And so your economics doesn't even come into that. This is a fundamental sort of, if you think about the hierarchy of values, this is sort of getting at the way we interact, the way we value, sort of levels below the environmental side. And then on the management side, I'm really interested in how we change the shape of these areas by the things that we're doing as coastal societies, by the institutions, formal and informal, that we use to manage them. So I have 2 ongoing projects right now. One is working with an NGO based up in Santa Cruz, and they've got a system of marine reserves, coastal reserves. They're in 6 countries around the world. And we're trying to understand how this reserve system is works differently in these different formal and informal governance contexts. So one sort of the analogy that we've come to is it's kind of like if you're familiar with the Forest Stewardship Council or the Marine Stewardship Council labeling. So their approach to reserve design is almost more akin to a labeling initiative than it is to like the California Marine Life Protected Act process. But it's an opportunity to sort of think about those factors that affect coastal conservation and compare them between different governance contexts. So I'm working with Nick is at the NGO, and Ulabari is in a plant econ and planning department at UC Irvine. So this is kind of the first paper that we're going to put out of what we envision is a sort of a longer term effort trying to study this system and how it works. And then another area of research that is increasingly important to me, and I'll talk about this one more, but trying to understand how we manage access to the coast, specifically in California, but this has implications elsewhere. We floated some of these issues just moments ago. Thank you for sticking around. But the coast is harder and harder to get to in one sense because in many places it's disappearing. And in another sense, there are social and demographic things happening which make living near the coast challenging for all but, the Hollywood A-listers and corporate chieftains, or whatever the first line of that article is. And yet in California, we've got some really remarkable policies to try to address this, to try to make sure that the coast is in fact available for all of us equally. And so this is sort of the first output of a project where we're trying to really tease that apart and understand, first and foremost, is that true? Is it equally accessible to everyone, and what does that mean, and what are the policy levers that maybe we want to pull to try to address that? And so if we think about, or if I, kind of organizationally, if I've got, how we affect the coast, how the coast affects us, what are the institutions that we use to manage that? One thing that I think is really interesting that is a way of sort of teasing, sort of insinuating into all of those other aspects of the human dimension side is citizen science, which is in part informed by, or could be informed by people's place attachment, which might motivate them to participate, by their local ecological knowledge, which might make them a better or worse participant in a citizen science project. But I'm really interested in citizen science as a tool, whether those are community members or students. It's a really interesting method for understanding, well, any question, but in my case, the coast. And so having relied on it for some projects, I'm working with a water quality engineer, Ali Baim, we put an NSF proposal together to try to understand in the environmental monitoring context why some people make better citizen scientists than others. So we just got this is an EAGER award, which is the early action grants for fun ideas, or I don't remember the acronym, but it's I guess a small grant for a pilot project, and we hope to take this and develop a submission for full RFP someday, but actually trying to understand how citizen science and how citizen scientists can feed into these other parts of sort of the coastal system, and both what can we sort of derive from that, but also what did the book and the public get out of that. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to just blow through 3 of these in a little bit more detail. And I try to reread some of these other things, you can ask me questions about them too, and hopefully I won't stumble too badly. So I'll just talk about the Costa Rica project. I'll talk about coastal access and this citizen science project. So climate change impacts on coastal resources in Costa Rica. And I want to say that the way that this project came about is I had a data set on coastal resources in California, and I was trying to find a student to help me deal with it. And I had worked with Diego in the past, and he was like, oh, I would love to help. I was like, oh, that's great. Like, come on, like, here's what I was thinking we could do. And he said, well, actually, here's what I was thinking we could do is I'm from Costa Rica, and I want to study Costa Rica. And so instead of him analyzing the data set that I already had, we got some money and sent him to Costa Rica, and we created a whole new data set. And so really the problem statement that we started with, and I'll try to stick with this model throughout, is that coastal tourism relies really heavily on coastal resources in Costa Rica. I'm not telling you it's obvious to you. Coastal tourism is a significant chunk of GDP in Costa Rica that, measured in the percents as opposed to the tenths of percents. That it sounds like small, but it's actually really big by GDP standards. But despite this, we don't actually have a good sense of how climate change is going to interact with some of these resources. So Diego and I developed this basic research question: is how will climate change impact coastal resources in Costa Rica? And so our approach was to sort of build on some of the work that I'd already done, combine sort of the local ecological knowledge of expert users with some simple models of what climate change might reasonably do to a coastline. So you can see how there's already like trying to combine these different things of the way I like to work. So what might one of those simple models look like? For example, if you have a projection for sea level rise by the end of the century, and this is just a mean projection bounded against a sort of a high-end projection and median projection. What we know is that the tide today goes up and down around this mean, so that's just the range of tide going up and down at present. And in the future, that tide is going to go up and down also, and there'll be some second-order effects, like the tide ranges might change, but we can basically ignore those. And what this means is that we can understand a little bit about future conditions based on what's happening on the coast today, because there is overlap in these ranges. For example, a beach that is lovely and you can spread your towel out on only at low tide at present, we would infer from this model, could potentially drown with, I can't read the numbers, but n numbers centimeters of sea level rise. And so it's a really simple model for helping us think about in the future, helping us think about what can we infer from present conditions to help let us know something about the future. And then what we did is we relied on the local experts that we found on the ground in Costa Rica, who could tell us about the quality and availability of different resources at sort of different ranges in this model and make some projections about how that might change in the future. So again, this is mixed methods. We're taking sort of a basic oceanographic model about what happens with tides and sea level rise, and combining with local ecological knowledge of lots of different local experts. I worked in 3 case communities. It was fun to build this out as a community-oriented effort. We got some money for Diego. We spent the whole summer working down in Costa Rica. I really wanted to go, but they had Zika, and my wife wouldn't let me for like really real reasons. So maybe I'll get to go back to Costa Rica someday. So over the course of his field season, we collected data via surveys, via in-depth local expert interviews, in a series of focus groups. 60 people over the course of the summer that he got to sit down with, many hundreds of minutes of audio recording from the interviews. And so again, we're asking these people for trying to collect in these different, sort of via these different methods, trying to get a sense of trying to collect this local ecological knowledge. What do these people know about this system? I'm just going to skip through this to just one example. So, because I showed you sort of the sea level rise and tide model, these are results for wave resource quality. And so if we think about what this is showing is for different, this is based on the testimony of these local experts. In the present, these lines show the relationship between tide height and resource quality. And so at different tide heights in these different communities, you have a different relation. You have a different, you see that the conditions are either better or worse. And so then we can take this data and apply this simple model and say, well, those conditions at the low end, we can reasonably project are going to disappear. And then as we get these new high tides that are outside of our current experience, what do these curves suggest those conditions might look like? And so we infer from this that the outlook is actually not good in any of these particular communities. So that's how we do that. As another example, this is looking at a different suite of conditions that affect what's happening on the beach and in the surf zone. And the top part of this chart is the number of people who said things were great during that particular season, and the bottom part is people who is when they said it was the worst. And so you see that in this sort of midwinter, that's when things are best, and out here in the late summer, early October, that's when things are worst. And sort of the timing of those things actually matters significantly for the tourism industry, because when people want to go and take advantage of these beaches and these waves when things are good. And as climate changes and the way that the peak seasonality of these things also shifts, you're going to, the timing of the tourism season may necessarily also have to change. So what kind of key takeaways from this project, we're still writing up right now. Once Diego wants to submit it, I think that's great. So he's working hard on this. We're also going to put together a kind of like a more like local facing piece that he'll write in Spanish and we'll put out with the local, not just in these three communities, but there's a group of folks who are interested in this in the University of Costa. I forget the university, but so like both an academic publication and a public facing publication will come out of this, which is fun.
You say University of Costa Rica? Is that what you said?
He has some friends and colleagues there that he's interested in getting involved and helping us spread the word about what's happening. So one thing that we get from this is actually like a baseline of what is the present day quality, and if we're interested in how things are changing in the world, unless you have something to compare that to, it's hard to say whether things changed. And in the same way that there's shifting baseline syndrome in fisheries, there's a very actual, real likelihood that we're going to have the same problem with a lot of other resources. That the beaches that I remember from when I was a kid, they're not as good now, but I only remember from when I was a kid. What my dad remembers from when he was a kid is going to be totally different. And so sort of our scale is going to slide, and that's a really interesting problem unless we start documenting these other kinds of coastal resources, see what's good and what's not good at any given time. We're not going to be able to understand how things are changing. Okay. So I want to talk about this. Yeah.
Can I ask a question on that project before you go to another project? So without a kind of a development pinch, right? So you have your sea levels coming up. If your sea level comes up, given a geomorphology perspective, you'll establish a new equilibrium profile and establish the new area of the wave break.
Yeah.
So it's not like you have a hardened shoreline where sea level's coming up and it's getting deeper and you lose your resource.
Yeah, so that is absolutely like the management implication that you would infer from this, that if you want that to happen,
right,
the best thing to do would be, because there are, in all of these communities, there's infrastructure in place.
Okay, that's my question. So is it a really developed coastline that you're looking at?
There's varying levels of development. So I've only been to a couple of those towns. It's not nearly at the level of California, and so managed retreat would be easier. And
Tamarindo is the most developed.
Yeah, because of the harbor and the.
Yeah.
So your graphs there that just show resource quality going down, is that assuming that the shoreline is fixed?
That is assuming, that is ceteris paribus, assuming nothing else changes.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the case of, and we know that that's not a real assumption, right? Because California's coastline was 140 meters further down 20,000 years ago, and yet we still have beaches now. And so part of it is a question of.
I mean, you'll have places that erode and places that will creep, and you'll have waves that will be lost here, but waves that will be gained here.
Yeah.
So
So it is not a perfect model, but as a starting point for saying, hey, we are going to have to make management decisions in these communities about what we're going to do as sea level comes up.
What are the priorities?
What are priorities? And so without information about like this to inform those decisions, then you're totally hosed. So it's a starting point. Any other questions about that one? So on the public access side, I want to say that this is a project I'm working on with a group of people at Center for Ocean Solutions. Lisa and Wynn are geospatial people. Eric is kind of like me in a thinking big picture, and Jesse is an attorney. So it's a fun interdisciplinary team of people that are all kind of thinking around this project together. So what we're really interested in here is the fact that, according to the Constitution in California, according to statute, the beach below the mean high tide line is ours. And by ours, I mean like ours. Like it actually belongs to us. It's held in trust by the state and managed, but our ability to get to the beach is changing. And so this is like, personally a really interesting question to me, because I was privileged, fortunate to grow up fairly close to the beach. And I'll never be able to top that again in my life. When you look at those houses in Malibu, the coastal property values, so the living close to the beach is increasingly out of reach. And so what we wanted to do with this project is start at a first level, get in and try to understand how accessible is the beach in light of the fact that it belongs to us, and there's laws that say that everyone should be able to get there. Can everyone get there equally? So here we took a geospatial approach. We worked with census data, and we worked also with a data set of basically where are the coastal access points in California. Now, just to try to explain what this looks like, here's the census data in California, and we'll just zoom in on one area of coastline, pick completely at random. And so if you have the locations of where everybody lives, you have the demographic data from the decennial census, and you overlay the map of where all of the coastal access points are, you can start to draw buffers around them. And once you draw these lines, you can figure out which census blocks fall within those lines. And once you know what census blocks they are, you can pretty much know everything that the U.S. Census, I was going to say the U.S. government, but there's other entities in the government. You know everything that the census knows about the people that live in this area. And so then what you can do is compare the demographic and other socioeconomic data about who lives there with everybody else at increasing distance. And so it's a pretty simple approach to asking this very broad, high-level question. And so this is what that looks like if you look at all the census tracts. Within 1 kilometer, they're this sort of pale yellow rim. Within 10, it's a thinner margin, and that just has to do with the size and shape of the census tracts, the way they're drawn. And then 100 kilometers, and then sort of everything beyond that. Not just of the coast, but specifically within a distance to a coastal access point. So this is, if you can see the beach from the road, that's not included. It's you can walk down those stairs or walk down that path or get between those houses and put your feet on sand or tide pools. And so when you start doing those comparisons, you generate a lot of really awful visuals. So I'm going to simplify. So again, this is the 1 in 15. So we stuck those numbers in that paper just because I want this number to get out there. I think it's such an interesting number.
I like it.
And there's different ways to make that comparison, right, between sort of who lives at certain distances versus who doesn't. And so we do it in a couple different ways, and what I'll just talk about right now is if you're to take the incredibly diverse population of California and assume that people were perfectly homogeneously distributed across the entire state, that's our baseline, and then we can look at deviations from that at certain distances from the coast. Does that methodologically, does that basically make sense? So what we find is close to the coast, the people are more white, less Hispanic and Latino, way less black, less American Indian, and less wealthy. And so the takeaway from the study is that the coast is rich, white, and also old, and that's not actually like a revolutionary finding. I mean, you need only spend 5 minutes on the beach in Malibu to figure that out, but it's kind of nice to put actual numbers behind the degree to which that has happened. And so that's what we've done in this paper. And then the question is, sorry, those all came up at once. Well, what do you do about this? We're not going to redistribute coastal wealth so that the population can be homogenous, and people don't live like that anyway. So what do you do about this? And that's a really interesting question. And what we developed when working with the attorneys is thinking about, well, what are the parts of the law that are actually relevant to addressing this problem, that are things that the Coastal Commission, whose job it is to implement public access policy, can and should start thinking more about. And they are things like parking. If you don't live close to the beach, you got to get there somewhere. When you get there, where are you going to park? So let's work on making parking more affordable. So for example, in Sonoma County State Parks, want to increase the parking fee. And it's like, oh, okay, like $5 to $8, is that a big deal? Well, that actually is a big deal, because that's the only way that this incredible swath of California is going to be able to use that resource. Things like public transit, and where do the buses stop? Are there bus stops near the coastal access points? Like, that seems like a no-brainer as a way of making the beach more accessible to people. Or even just the signage, like once you get to the road at the coast where the bus lets out. So another thing that was kind of been written in and out of the Coastal Act over the years, low-cost overnight accommodation at the coast. So the people that live greater than 100 miles, 100 kilometers, that's like pushing the limits of day trip. And if all you have when you get to the beach are, W hotels, and it's not possible. So can we increase campsite opportunities? Can we increase other types of maybe more family friendly overnight accommodation? So there's just sort of three policy levers that the Coastal Commission actually has some authority over, that they can work to implement to try to address some of these disparities that we see with accessibility. I'll just say that sort of that's just this is just the first pass analysis. We can hopefully talk about this more later. I almost pointed to the laser pointer. That's bad. But one thing that we haven't yet built into the way that we do this is the sea level rise component. And you could imagine the way we did this was taking where the coastal access points are and sort of looking outwards at where the people are. But you could also think about reversing analysis to understand which coastal access points serve the greatest or most diverse populations of people. And that would be a way to give managers a prioritization scheme for going forward. Maybe we only have X dollars to restore coastal access points or make them safe, or put a bathroom in, and which ones do we use? Well, you should move those resources towards the access points that serve the broader, more diverse populations. Sea level rise is this whole interesting wrinkle that we haven't built in yet either. If only we had a geomorphologist on the team. Because we want to do that. Any questions about that project?
Well, I think that's huge, and I think, for example, the low-cost coastal accommodations is one of the greatest struggles in Malibu for the last 15, 20 years, and the city is actively fought.
Yeah, they're a real pain in the ass.
And when we talk about the from the earlier exercise, it's having significant negative consequences for this organization, for Santa Monica Coastal Conservancy, because people are now undercutting them. They're saying you're not doing enough to support our diverse groups, because they're not getting the results they want, but it's because they're being blocked by this one entity, and a massive amount of effort has gone into. So the overall mission of this public entity is being harmed by the fact that we're not allowed to put campsites in, basically.
Well, it's something they've done really well in San Diego County too, that the state parks has basically that role in
the survey.
Yeah, especially up in North County, they've
Yeah.
done a good job with the campsites.
Just finished a 5-year study looking at public transit in California to public lands.
Oh.
And the beaches were not, because it was a Forest Service funded project.
Yeah, so they weren't even-
Really weren't interested in beaches, but that's like the next frontier
Yeah.
in terms of public lands and access with, so this is
The,
cool.
the Coastal Conservancy just put out is doing a statewide poll that is something we haven't even talked about, but we should totally talk about. Basically focused specifically on barriers to access to beaches, and so it's sort of commensurate with what Phil's doing, but coming out of the not state lands, the Coastal Conservancy. Yeah. So there's a lot of interest right now in this at the state level. Okay. You can ask me about those pictures later. I love to talk about them. So in this third one, I want to talk about this citizen science project, and this is totally like live in progress right now. So I'm like miles from having results that are shareable. So I thought maybe I could just use it as an opportunity to just talk a little bit about some of the fun process things we've been dealing with that have emerged from doing this mixed methods and very interdisciplinary project. So the problem statement here, that's a doozy, but citizen science is this increasingly widely used tool for scientists to collect data and for the public to be engaged with and learn about science. But there are the validity, the robustness of citizen science collected data is often questioned on the academic side of things and say, well, how do you know that data is any good? Who are these people collecting it? And so there hasn't been a lot of sort of focus inward, thoughtful reflection from those people who use citizen science to understand what makes it good or not. And so we wanted to try to tackle that challenge with this particular project and sort of ask this very basic question, like what explains the differences in data quality among citizen scientists? And kind of the obvious answer is like, well, if you've been trained to collect data well, you probably will collect data better than someone who hasn't been trained. That's so much for that problem. So we try to try to think a little bit more holistically and to draw on some of these things that I've talked a little bit already, local ecological knowledge that might cause people to be more informed about a system, and perhaps that might enable them to collect data in a more valid way. Or perhaps they have a very strong place attachment to that place, which makes them really motivated to participate well in this project versus people who don't. So I think in our proposal, we said, we're going to recruit surfers and non-surfers with the idea that the people who visit these beaches every day to surf have this really vested interest in the water quality, and they might therefore, and a whole suite of local ecological knowledge about that system, and that might cause them to be better citizen scientists than someone who just walks their dog or takes their kid to splash around on weekends. But what we're trying to get is really a broad swath of folks. So our approach to this is to have enough control over measuring the data validity. We had to design the water quality study in addition to the citizen science studies. We've got this nested approach where we're actually designed a citizen science-based water quality monitoring survey looking at stormwater coming out of some urban areas in 2 communities in Central Coast. And then we nested within that a study of the volunteers themselves and the quality of the data that they're collecting. So I'll just take these sort of the separate studies one at a time. So we are specifically interested in the fate and transport of from a public health perspective, water quality pollutants. So my collaborator on this project focuses really heavily on like fecal coliform and other human relevant pathogens that enter the marine system. And if they're coming from the stormwater, which we know it's actually easier to just trace, for example, what the fresh water is doing and where it's going, it's easy to monitor whether water is fresh or not, and you can from that infer where the pathogens might be moving also. So fate and transport of runoff in the coastal zone. So we have to date recruited roughly 60 volunteers from 2 coastal communities. They have volunteered to collect both data and water samples from 5 different locations near these stream mouths. weekly for 13 weeks, this whole winter. And what we can do is when you have that, when you have sufficient, when you have enough data in both space and time, you can actually input that into some mixing models that show you where runoff from those streams is what it's actually doing along that beach. And like, why is that actually interesting? Well, let's say you know that there was a spill upstream and you want to put a sign that says the water is polluted. Do you close the entire beach? Do you close just the first 100 yards on either side of the stream? Do you leave that there for a day? Do you leave that there for 3 days? So there are public health and there are public health policy implications for what's happening. So we recruited all these volunteers to do this project, and they, and this is a video I wanted to show, but we don't have, I'm just going to skip it now, but beach.stanford.edu, we had some students in an environmental communications class for a class project produce this video for us, and it's really, I think it's bitchin', so I hope that they like went to the beach and like recruited random people on the beach. I mean, so you should watch the video. So we recruited all these people, and they started sampling last week. So in the meantime, we have this hypothesis that the people that are more vested, and I'm just trying to define what vested is not a technical term, but the people that are more vested, more invested in the coast as a place, as a resource that they know a lot about, as a place that they have a lot of site fidelity to. Is it, do they go to the same beach every single morning, or do they only go once a week? And so we, everyone is taking a pre-post surveys in which we're trying to assess through a variety of different indexes, a lot of indices, a lot of this kind of information about their relationship with the coast as a place that we suspect could inform the way that they are collecting this data.
And not compensated anyway.
No compensation whatsoever. And what I forgot to mention is the water samples that they collect come back to the lab, and we get to double check everything that they've done. So every sample that they collect and measure, we will then collect and measure. And so we've developed maybe I've got that on here, a participation index that basically gives us a sense of how accurate were the data they collected, and other aspects of their participation. Did they collect the water when we asked them to, when they said they would? The basic assumption is that they're not going to lie to us, and we have some ways of actually testing that assumption also. So this is happening now. The pre-survey is out. People are taking it. They are, hopefully, we're starting to get hundreds of emails, dozens of emails about, oh, I've got this question about the protocol, and like, am I doing it right? And so this is in progress right now. And so I just thought, okay, we haven't enough time to talk about all this fun stuff. So I thought we could just reflect a little bit on sort of the interdisciplinarity that has sprung up as interesting challenges in this, because this project is a water quality monitoring project, and it's a social science study of participation, and it's also volunteer management, and we're going to have, hopefully we'll get up to 100, but at least 60 people out there. They need 60 sampling kits, and so you got to make a sampling kit, and they have to do it 60 more times. I have no idea what I meant by emergent hurdles. Maybe those are the things that, maybe there's the hurdles that we're going to have to jump that I don't know what they are yet. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that have been unexpectedly really hard about this project. One is that because we're studying people and their motivations and attitudes and knowledge, we need IRB approval to study. IRB is the sort of university ethics board that governs how we study people. And we also are sending volunteers to the beach. And so the Office of Risk Management is involved, and they're concerned with the university's liability. What if someone stubs their toe or gets swept away by a sneaker wave? They want to cover our asses. But there's things so the obvious thing is, have them sign a waiver and release the university of liability, except that if you're participating in a research study, you are not allowed to sign a waiver and release your liability. And so it's oh my God, how do we? So we've had some really interesting long meetings with these two different offices on campus trying to get around this very practical point of how do we do this study that is both things. Another really interesting challenge, and this is the last thing, I'll just skip to the end after this, is we're trying to study their participation. If it's really easy, if it's like a no-brainer to go out there and scoop the water and come back, then everybody's going to have like 100% participation score. So we had to design a sampling protocol that would at once yield data that we could do something with on the water quality side, but would also be challenging enough for the untrained volunteer that they won't all do it perfectly. And so that was a really fun challenge itself. And the way we built that in is through the way you have to calibrate the refractometers we're measuring salinity with. And if they don't calibrate well, we'll be able to tell when we double check all the samples. And so there's this extra step. So that's been a fun challenge. And I'll just say that, the way that I would recruit a bunch of volunteers to participate in a survey like this, I'm like, oh, do you love the beach? Like, come on down. Hey, do you go to the beach all the time? Like, come on down. But we can't ask them that because I don't want to prime them on the social science side that, like, if they're thinking, oh, well, I was recruited to study because I come here all the time, that's going to affect the way that they answer. So all these things fit together have made this really fun challenge, and it's been neat working with the water quality team to fit all those things together, and with the communication students in terms of like how they do the messaging. So when you watch this video, it's kind of pat and it's not mundane, but like we're really careful in the language that we use to recruit people. So just kind of a way of overall summary and reflection. I try to think of my work as interdisciplinary and as sort of question oriented. There's things that I'm interested in, but I try to get my prompts on what's happening in the real world in terms of what sort of things I like to tackle. I would like to think that it's management relevant, that we're trying to ask and answer questions that are like having very real implications for what's going on the coast right now. This is the Ventura Harbor dredge effluent plume. And as indicated by this terrible clip art, I like to be collaborative. I like to involve students wherever possible. And I like to work with other people. It makes it more fun. And then the last thing I say is that, California is my place. There's other interesting places. It's really been fun doing this project in Costa Rica, but I like to think that what I do is locally relevant here. So it's just sort of some broad takeaways. Just thinking ahead in terms of sort of effects and on both sides, I'm really interested in shoreline modification. I think this is going to be a hugely pressing topic in California on the coast in years to come, not just in Malibu, but in lots and lots of places. And so there's some good examples locally to study both the ecosystem and the social system and how they fit together around sort of some shoreline modification projects. Sea level rise is only going to make this more pressing. On the management side, we're definitely moving ahead with this comparative governance project and trying to, we briefly talked about some of Ostrom's theories earlier. We're trying to build that out. I'm working with a student now, taking the coastal access work and trying to build it up around a theoretical framework for what does it mean for access to be not just access, but to be meaningful access. So that's kind of fun and interesting too. And I think those things are really relevant to the Beach Sustainability Index that I know Kiki happens to be working on. I'd love to continue working on the citizen science front. And I think the last thing I'll say, this is California historic and projected population growth. These LA, San Diego, and Orange County are big, so they have a separate scale. But Ventura is not only of the smaller counties the largest, but it's also, if you were to take the derivative of all those curves, it is projected to grow the fastest. So this is going to be a really interesting place to tackle some of these questions about how does our coastal society live in the coastal zone. And like a lot of these dearly held policies and values are going to be kind of put to the test, I think, in Ventura just in the coming decades as this population grows and as the ocean encroaches. So hopefully I've done that. And I'll stop. Because there's only 5 minutes left.